Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the Cleone P. Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, as the state continues to grapple with the COVID-19 crisis, schools seek to balance safety and academic success. As Congress debates another relief package, Utah's small businesses struggle to stay afloat. While the election may be over, infighting continues as political leaders on both sides of the aisle caution against divisiveness and polarization. Good evening and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Amy Donaldson, reporter with the Deseret News, Representative Brian King, minority leader in Utah's House of Representatives, and Rod Arquette, host of the Rod Arquette Show. Thank you for being with us today. Big week in politics, but so many different tentacles from politics to policy to the future of our parties. We're going to get to all of it today. I want to start with COVID-19 first. Amy, let's start with you, giving us a perspective of what's happening in the state of Utah. Our numbers are high, but leveling. Give us a status report on where we are.
Well, we passed a grim milestone this week. Just yesterday, we passed 1,000 deaths, 1,016 Utahns have been lost to COVID. We're averaging about 2,800 cases over a 7-day period. Our positive rate is about 26.2%, which is down. It got up as high as like 30. I mean, I think we had one day where it was 42%, just that single day. But the bottom line is 500,000, or 250,000 Utahns have tested positive for COVID. So it's been, I think, a really tough week in a lot of ways. So true.
Representative King, so many people are talking about our numbers, and it turns out people are still not wearing their masks.
Yeah, and it's remarkable, isn't it? I mean, I have some people emailing me in my capacity as representative who say, shame on you for talking about this in as aggressive a manner as you are. Everybody knows masks don't work. There's no evidence to show masks work. And I just go, I don't know what universe you're living in, but this is not what anybody who with knowledge says. And in fact, the evidence, the best empirical evidence shows that masks are very effective when combined with social distancing and combined with small groups and, you know, avoiding public exposure to people that you don't know. Those are remarkably effective at holding down the numbers. So I think we just have to keep going up, you know, doing the best that we can. And I have some thoughts about whether the state is doing enough, but you may ask about that.
Yeah, later. I want to talk about that in just a second too. But I want to ask this question to you, Rod. Up to the election, so many of us, even on this show, talked about the politics are at the heart of the mask, right? Are you a Republican? You can tell if you're wearing a mask or not, if you're a Democrat. Has that changed at all in your mind since the election, or does that division remain?
I think the division still remains. I'm going to question your point you made that people aren't wearing masks. I think a lot of people are still. I mean, as I go out shopping, the limited holiday shopping I've done so far, or to restaurants, I was at a fairly good-sized restaurant and eating the other day, and everybody's wearing masks except when they're eating. So I think they are. It was interesting today. I saw this study. It's a French study that just came out this morning, I think, which basically said, you know, wearing a mask lulls you into a false sense of security when it comes to social distancing. And social distancing may be even more important than a mask. And so I think the mask wearing is still very, very political. I personally see a lot of people wearing them, but I think that was an interesting study that with a mask, you're lulled into this sense of security so we can get a little bit closer. And really, the social distancing is a key.
Yeah, and the next thing is... Go ahead, Amy.
I want to jump in on are most people wearing masks, because I think one thing, there's two issues with that. I've been covering these protests where people are not wearing masks, where they feel like it's an infringement of their civil rights to be asked to wear a mask or to have a mask mandate from the government. So there are a good number of people who are not participating and not wearing masks. I think when you're talking about schools and churches, there's some control. I think you saw the LDS church leaders come out, which I've been saying faith leaders need to step up into this space, because in Utah especially, people respond much better to faith leaders and very direct messages than they do political mandates or political messaging. But I think there are still a good number of people who are not wearing masks, and there are a good number of people who are not wearing masks in the risky type places. So indoors, extended family gets together, they're not wearing masks. That's where, 70% of the cases are spread in small social gatherings between friends and family.
Well, let me add to that, Amy. I think those who are wearing masks sometimes aren't wearing them properly. I see them around the neck all the time, or below the nose. They aren't wearing it properly, and that's the other issue. If you're going to wear it properly.
A lot of this leads to what the bright spot was of this week, is this vaccine is here. They're here in the state. Probably Representative King started getting some of those vaccines for frontline workers this week. Right.
Healthcare workers are number one priority, which I think is appropriate. Governor came out. We actually had some input as representatives. The Speaker and the President asked the legislators informally a week or so ago, what are your preferences about priorities? And I was heartened to see that there was a lot of common feeling that those who are on the front lines in terms of health care, in terms of first responders, and vulnerable populations, the elderly, folks in long-term care facilities, folks in hospitals, things like that, need to get the vaccination first. But it was interesting to see, and heartening for me, and to see the governor say that teachers are right up there next in line, which I think is a good thing. Amy,
let's talk about that for a moment, because that is a huge step forward in terms of the policy for the educators, right? This is something the teachers have been talking about. If you want to get our kids back in school, it's going to require vaccines for these teachers. Talk about how big of a step that was for the governor to make that statement.
I think it was actually a tremendously meaningful action for teachers. Teachers feel very second-guessed and attacked, and there are a lot of ways they don't feel supported right now. I don't think a lot of them even got the 5 masks that were promised at the beginning of this pandemic. There were PPE that was promised to teachers that they ended up fundraising for themselves and buying for themselves. Some of the districts stepped up, but some of those promises just didn't materialize. So I think more than anything, it was an emotional lift for them to be able to hear, yes, we see you as this important, that we're going to put you at the front of the line. I think vaccines are going to be your next political debate, though, medical, political, the same way masks have been.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because it's a great point. Even as you mentioned, Representative, that you and your colleagues were questioned about that. There are people who said, wow, is this a political question? Is that why we're asking about these priority lists or something else? Which is why you see some people saying, well, who's really in charge of making these decisions?
Yeah, no, and as Amy says, you're going to have a significant portion of the population that says, I don't think so on the vaccine. And I've had many emails saying, please make sure that the vaccination process is an opt-out, it's optional, it's not mandatory. It isn't going to be mandatory, I don't think. I don't see how you can make it mandatory, but I do think that there has to be, and every public health official I've heard talk about this says, there has to be a certain level of vaccination or you're not going to have the kind of immunity, herd immunity, that we want to develop. It's got to be up 75, 80% or you got problems. So I don't know that we're going to get to that number in Utah because there are a lot of people who say vaccinations of any type, I'm not going to have anything to do with it. And they certainly are even more suspicious of this particular vaccination.
And the challenge is going to be picking up on that. If it is the Pfizer vaccination, it comes in 2 steps. And after you get the first vaccination, it's another month or 5 weeks, and you'll still have to wear your mask. You'll still have to social distance during that period of time. So will people even follow up and get that second shot? Yeah. That's going to be the challenge. And rolling this out, not only in the state of Utah, but around the country and around the world, what a task that is going to be.
Huge.
That is for sure. We're going to have to see how we do.
Let's talk about how this was going to roll out into these schools, because it's such a great point about these teachers, because we had some numbers this week about what's happening in some of our school districts, particularly the Salt Lake City School District. And it seems like this is the big question for these districts, is you're balancing health and safety versus the education aspects of it. These seem to be the 2 big questions that are coming forward. Every district in the state has a combination of in-class or online, except for Salt Lake City School District. They're entirely online. Let's talk about the numbers that have happened this week, Amy, because we did get some numbers from that district to see how they're doing. And it turns out 364 high school students in Salt Lake City School District failed every single class in the first quarter. That's a 600% increase. Interesting numbers as we start to see what the impact has been.
I don't think anybody who's had teenagers trying to do online classes is surprised by those numbers at all. I think that I think we're going to find that this pandemic has set people who are already on the margins behind even further. I think kids are safer in school if they're observing the social distance and the mask wearing. Just like you see lower rates among sports teams, when there's a reason for somebody to take these precautions, to be careful, they're doing it. It's out with their friends after school or at home that they're not taking these precautions. And the kids who are already at risk are more at risk now. And they are living in multi-generational homes, or they're living in homes where if somebody gets sick from work, they can't isolate. And they're there trying to do their schoolwork in the middle of we do it in the middle of the kitchen. So it's in my opinion, an unmitigated disaster. And we're going to be trying to rectify this, the way this was handled, for maybe years to come.
Yeah, you've got to get the kids back in school. I agree with Amy. That's where they're going to advance, but the teachers need the protections, the vaccine, they need the equipment to protect themselves again. But you look at the online training, the reading scores seem to be holding from what I've seen so far. It is the math scores that there really is a challenge. And I just look at my own grandchildren and their moms trying to figure out today's math, and they can't figure it out either. And that's going to be the real challenge, is to mom and dad step up, but do you have the skills to step up to help your kids through math, which is taught differently today than it was years ago?
Yeah, what are you hearing about this, Representative? Because this is the real question you're talking about here, this unmitigated disaster, as Amy was just talking about, because there are long-term impacts. You have some risk inside the schools of some kind of exposure, but you have this very long-term negative impact of this. How are these school districts approaching this right now, and is there going to be maybe even a conversation with Salt Lake about this? Yeah,
well, Salt Lake, as you say, has been on the end of the spectrum in terms of saying we're not going to have any in-person learning at all. And I think that's going to be interesting to watch the numbers come in. You mentioned some numbers that show that we have some significant failure rates in terms of a lot of these kids. What we don't know is how they compare to other school districts that have a combination of in-person and virtual learning. I think one of the things, to follow up on what Rod and Amy were saying, is that this has revealed is the kind of problems that are created for particularly low socioeconomic folks not having access. You can't have effective virtual learning when you don't have access to the internet. And the people who are least likely to have access to the internet, of course, are those on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. So that adds to the importance, the need for us to come up with a good way of teaching our kids. And I think it's interesting to watch other countries that in some ways have done better than the United States in dealing with this pandemic. They have placed incredible priority on making sure that kids get in-person education, because they know how disastrous it is for the kids on the lower socioeconomic spectrum to not have the ability to get the education they need.
And the question is, what are you going to do with the kids who have fallen behind? Do you hold them back for a year? Do you advance them? How much remedial education? I mean, Amy is in there, and I can see her shaking her head as well. What do you do with these kids?
The bottom line is it's going to hurt their confidence. It's going to hurt them emotionally in ways. It's going to disadvantage them across the board in ways that we haven't even begun to figure out and unravel yet. And I would just piggyback on what Brian says. You don't have access to the internet. You may not have the equipment, the computer or the technology, the actual hardware in your house, or you're sharing with 2 or 3 brothers and sisters, and your parents probably work 2 jobs. They're probably essential workers. So they're not sitting there making sure you're doing the homework, even if you're doing your level best to participate. Listen, I helped my granddaughter with an online kindergarten class, and these teachers deserve 1,000 times what they're making. I don't know if you've ever tried to do a Zoom call with 5-year-olds. It was unbelievable. And it just kind of drove home to me all the things I've been hearing and reading through my job. I just thought, this is a 45-minute, she gets 45 minutes of kindergarten. That's not enough.
Well, Jason, it's an interesting thing that you see some of the representatives and senators who represent those areas, the underserved areas, that have more lower socioeconomic folks in them. They're the ones who oftentimes are most vocal about saying, we need to have an in-person option. And it's because of this reality that we're talking about. They know what their constituents have to deal with. And so I think that we may see, one of the things we're handicapped, we're talking about this without having all the data that we need to really analyze and evaluate how Salt Lake City's performance compares to other school districts. So we got to get all the information, and then we can evaluate it intelligently.
Yeah, is that what they're waiting for?
Brian, don't you think part of the issue is that families are afraid because there isn't a solid plan. They don't understand, and they don't really, a solid plan about how they're going to keep people, teachers, staff, and students safe is not being communicated. I think that's really a bigger issue than where are you safest?
Yeah, well, and I think that you're right, and that, one of the reasons that exists in the way that you're talking about, Amy, is because there's a healthy split and division of opinion among the school board in the Salt Lake City School District about the best way to handle this.
Well, is that the reason why, Amy, that they can't come up with a plan? Because they certainly haven't come up with any real plan.
Brian is generous, and I don't disagree. I don't disagree that there's a difference of opinion, but I also think we have known, the science has been out there since the spring. We knew the fall and winter months were going to be tougher. I see this, at the college level, covering college sports. You don't start your season in November and think you're going to play every game. I think that the plan, we had time to deal with this. We had time to get PPE to these teachers. We had time to come up with a comprehensive plan for all the different situations. There isn't one solution for one district. There might not even be one solution for one classroom. But we don't have that kind of leadership, that kind of takeover, and let's just dissect this thing and solve this problem, and then communicate how we're going to keep your kids safe, why you should trust us with them. That's not happening.
Well, I want to pick up on that, and I think what you just said a moment ago, Amy, communication. I think from the very beginning of all of this, there has been a lack of really good communication, because you're getting conflicting reports, conflicting studies, conflicting, we're this, do this, do this. And I don't think there has been a consistent message communicated to people out there so they go, oh, okay, I get it. I understand what's going on.
Yeah. Well, so this gets to this really great point you made, Representative, just this week on the radio, KCPW is where you were. Just a really great comment about how our elected officials need to step up, how we need to do more, the governor's office and everyone else. Maybe part of it is related to what Rod was just saying.
Oh, yeah, no, I agree. And, the governor can be the cheerleader, and he sets a very important tone in terms of messaging. And I think in many ways, the governor's done a good job. He's not anywhere near the poor messaging, the terrible messaging we've seen out of the Oval Office, for example. He hasn't gone as far as I'd like to see in terms of putting the force of law behind the evidence and the public health information that we have to say. For example, I went on a little road trip, a solo road trip, and I had no problem social distancing and no problem keeping away from people, but I went to California right after Thanksgiving, and there were many signs in public places saying, you will be fined up to $100 if you don't wear a mask. I mean, it was very clear. And I was impressed by the degree to which people were wearing masks throughout that state. And it's not a surprise to me that you have rates of transmission and positive testing rates that are lower in California and have been lower for many weeks and months than in Utah. The same is true if you want to take a better example in terms of a state our size. Oregon has significantly more people, about 1 million more people than we do, and significantly lower numbers of both positive rates and transmissions and infections and deaths. So there is a way of doing it behind putting the force of law behind this stuff that's going to result in greater, better outcomes that we could do and should do.
I will disagree with Brian. I think if you put the force of law, more and more people are going to object to it. There's a streak of fierce independence in this state. Don't tell me what to do. And you use law to come after me, that makes it even harder for me to agree to do it. So I would disagree with them a little bit.
So let's put this into perspective, too, because I want to get to this. Go ahead, Amy, sorry.
I was just going to say, don't pass laws that you can't enforce.
Yeah.
Don't give a mandate that most of our sheriff's departments are not going to enforce. I do think the mandate's helpful, but let's not lie to ourselves and say it's being enforced in every corner of the state. Also, Oregon has more deaths than we do by 100.
Well, this very conversation kind of goes to the heart of this next issue, which is so important to us, which is, are we going to come together on a few of these items? I want to talk about polarization in the United States, maybe a little bit in the state of Utah. This issue kind of lays that out a little bit as well. But I want to talk about the election for a second. So election's over, the Electoral College numbers are in, the states have certified their elections. but we still have people fighting about this. All right, so give us an idea, because we have a lawsuit that's filed, Texas. May Representative, take a second and talk about what that lawsuit was, because we have a Utah and Sean Reyes, our Attorney General, that's right in the heart of that.
Right. So the Texas Attorney General filed a lawsuit asking for original jurisdiction with the U.S. Supreme Court to challenge the election results in, I think it was, I could be wrong about the 4 states. I don't think Nevada was part of it, but I think it was
Georgia,
Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan.
Yeah.
And 18 attorney generals have signed on to that, including Texas, and Mr. Reyes, Attorney General Reyes here in Utah, was one of them. And that was problematic from my perspective, simply because there's no good reason to think that there has been any degree of fraud that would call into question the results in the presidential election of those 4 states, or any other state for that matter. And yet we, as you say, continue to inject doubt and questions. And there was a Quinnipiac poll just yesterday that said 70% of Republicans believe that Joe Biden's election to president is not legitimate. Well, what does that portend for the future in terms of our ability to get things done in this country and for us to move forward in a positive direction? It's a terrible thing, and it's undermining the ability to govern effectively over the next 4 years.
And I
so
take this back
please,
a little bit. I wonder if there was a similar poll taken in 2016 and how many Democrats felt that the election of Donald Trump was not legitimate.
Rod, I don't think it was anywhere near the number. I'm sure that there were a significant number of Democrats who felt it was not legitimate in 2016. But 70%, I'd be shocked.
Well, and the question I have on I think what Texas is asking, and you may know better than this, but Texas is saying, hey, we don't like the way they did their election, so we think you should invalidate their electoral votes. That's what I think it basically comes down to. And
that's not what they're saying.
Well, but
they're
I think
if
it's along those lines, I think the Supreme Court probably is not going to touch this.
Well, they're not going to touch it because there's not anything supporting the allegations they're making. Yeah. So
that's right.
But to the issue of polarization, I don't see it getting any better.
No.
You have 106 Republican representatives who also signed on to this lawsuit.
Which is a majority of the Republican caucus in the House.
So it lends credibility to things that we should, be able to read about and dismiss, right? They've hand counted the ballots in Georgia. They've recounted, I think they've now determined it 3 different times, 3 different ways.
Same in Wisconsin.
And so I feel like we've aired the grievances. We've discussed what the evidence or lack of evidence is, the allegations are, and anybody can see that they're pretty absurd. But I mean, I thought the responses from the AGs from the 4 states in question, they were as scathing responses I have ever seen in legal filings, which are pretty boring and not fun to read. But there's no way that this works, because then you'll see California suing Texas for shutting down all their polling places and engaging in voter suppression.
The bigger question that you had, division in this country, it's not going to get any better for a long, long time, unfortunately. There's nobody out there. The 2 sides are as divided as they've ever been. People are divided as they've ever been on so many issues. It's a real challenge.
Well, to follow up on what Rod says, to a remarkable degree, conservatives and Republicans particularly have been taught and have learned how effective it is for the party leader, in this case Donald Trump over the last 4 years, to play that line in terms of the political tactic and strategy of dividing, and having, in doing so, ensure that their base is incredibly loyal, incredibly reliable.
Well, talk about, I'm curious about do you want to comment on that first,
I
Rod?
want to pick up on that. I think the Democrats have learned a little bit of that too, Brian, and here's why. Dianne Feinstein. I mean, she has been brutally attacked over the last couple of weeks for her saying, the judiciary and the Amy Coney Barrett hearings were well done. She hugged Lindsey Graham, and she's been brutalized for that within the Democratic Party. So this question of party loyalty now is really an interesting question that's surfaced.
Well, particularly if you take this fact in, as soon as Sean Reyes said that he was going to file this lawsuit, he got an immediate response from the governor of Utah saying, I disagree that we should do it. We weren't even consulted about this.
Right.
And then you immediately...
And the governor-elect.
and Lieutenant, yes, and the governor-elect said that as well. But then you also have Mitt Romney coming out immediately saying it is madness.
Yes, this is a joke. joke.
So even within the Republican Party, which I'm so curious about what you were just saying, Rod.
That's true. It's interesting that you say that, though, because that's true in Utah, Jason. But as Rod points out, I'm not sure that other states have the kind of healthy division, I do think it's a healthy division, that the Republican leadership, elected leadership in Utah have demonstrated on this particular point.
Mm-hmm. Amy, how are you seeing that division play out?
I think I don't see it getting better. I think everyone says they want moderacy. They want us to come together. They want to love. But what polarizes, what gets people out to the polls? It's not peace and love.
Yeah.
It's not, it's not all the good stuff that you're going to do for them. I think Joe Biden and Kamala Harris delivered a pretty moderate and pretty loving, let's heal, their motto was make America kind again, which was touching, but is it enough? Is it electrifying? Look at how Democrats did down ticket. Joe Biden didn't help the Democrats down the ticket, or the parties didn't. I think things are going to get a little bit better. I never thought Donald Trump created this problem, and I don't think Donald Trump, it ends with him. I certainly don't think he's going away, but I don't think that this ends, and we have come to see each other as not as people, but as political party affiliations, and that's a dangerous, tough thing, especially during a pandemic.
About 10 seconds.
Politics has become more like religion than it ever has.
Contempt. You've got to remove the contempt we're having for each other to get anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Maybe that's why we need the Utah way a little bit more. Yes. A little more Utah around the world.
There you go.
Maybe good. Thank you all for your insights tonight. And thank you for watching the Hinckley Report. This show is also available as a podcast on pbsutah.org/Hinckley Report or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you next week.